So, hi everybody. Thank you so much for coming along to what will be our final session of the semester. So, my name's Eve Hayes Bikalaf. I'm a visiting fellow here at the Centre for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at the Institute of Modern Languages Research at the University of London. So, as I've said, this will be our final series of our final seminar of 2021. And we relaunched this series earlier this year, and we've had a really fantastic response from many of you. A huge thank you just to a few people. So thank you to my colleague Jack Webb, who is part of the Race, Roots and Resistance Collective of the University of Manchester. Jack's been working tirelessly behind the scenes to help and to organise and put together this seminar series, and he regrettably can't be with us this semester because of teaching commitments, but I'm really hoping that some of you will get to see his face a little bit more in the coming year. So thank you also to the IMLR staff behind the scenes who've also been really fantastic in helping organise and put all of this out on social media and just spread the word about these sessions. So I'm going to recap really, really quickly what we have enjoyed, the sessions that we've enjoyed over the past 3 months. So on the 12th of October, we had our speaker was Mimi Scheller, who is Dean of the Global School at Worcester Polytechnic Institute, and our chair, Shadona Kettle, who is a PhD candidate at UCL Institute of the Americas. And Mimi gave a fantastic paper entitled A Revindication of Patient Futures Beyond Disaster Discourses. Now that video is now online on the IMLR CLAC's website, so I'll put that in the chat for you and really encourage you to watch that because it really was a very special and timely, I think, presentation on Haiti. On the 16th of November, we had our speaker Jake Sir Brian Richards from LSE and Adam Philogene Heron of Goldsmiths, who was our chair. And Jake gave a wonderful paper on the warfare origins of the anti-slave trade legal regime in the Atlantic world. And as this was a working paper, and we didn't record this session, but that's fine. We want this to be a space basically for people, a platform for people to present their research in any format and to bounce ideas off each other and basically use it as a friendly space to share your ideas and your work. So today we've got our fantastic speaker Kesewa John of UCL Institute of Americas, and we have Zakiya McKenzie of Exeter who will be chairing. I'll leave Zakiya to introduce our paper for us, but just to let you know that we're very excited. So we've got some dates for your diaries, and we'll be shortly announcing our new official programme for 2022. And I just want to confirm some of the amazing speakers that we've got, because this is now on the CLAC's, IMLR CLAC's website, and you can start registering for this now. So on the 25th of January, we will have Juan Ponce Vasquez from the University of Alabama, who will be presenting a paper entitled Speaking of Contraband, Presentation of Islanders and Empire, Smuggling and Political Defiance in Hispaniola, 1580 to 1690. That's the title of his book that came out last year, I believe. It's a really, really fantastic book. Also really excited to tell you that on the 22nd of February, we have the phenomenal James Cantra of City University, New York. And James will be presenting a paper entitled Nothing of This Kind in Britain, Caribbean Radicalism and Revolutionary Epistemologies Across the 1960s Black Atlantic. And I really recommend his really just phenomenal book called Blackening Britain, Caribbean Radicalism and From Windrush to Decolonisation, which his talk will be based on. And then we have 3 more dates before I pass you over. So on the 22nd of March, the 10th of May and the 14th of June. And all the details of these sessions I will confirm, they'll be confirmed on the website shortly. If you would like to chair any one of these sessions, then we're especially looking for postgraduate students or early career researchers to become more involved and to help us with the organisation of these activities. So please just reach out to me directly. I'll put my email in the chat for you. And without further ado, then let me pass over to Zakiya McKenzie, and she is going to take the reins for us. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Hello, everyone. Great to see you. My name is Zakiya McKenzie. I am a PhD student at the University of Exeter with a Caribbean Literary Heritage project. My dissertation is on Black and West Indian newspapers in England post World War II up to about 1980. And so I'm very happy, actually really excited to chair this session today and welcome Dr. Kesewa John to read her paper on radical Black newspapers in the Caribbean itself. So my research happened after the writers who wrote in the Caribbean moved to London. Dr. Kesewa John is an associate lecturer in Caribbean history at the Institute of the Americas, University College of London. Prior to joining UCL, Dr. John was a junior fellow at the Université des Antilles in Guadeloupe, 2019 to 2021, and also a teaching fellow at the Université des Antilles in Martinique between 2012 and 2015. Dr. John obtained her PhD in history this year from the University of Chichester, and she also holds a master's in teaching French as a foreign language and another MA in ethnicity, globalization, and culture, which she earned in 2011. Her research explores gender in Caribbean people's political history, specializing in transatlantic multilingual linkages between Afro-Caribbean activists and the evolution and dissemination of early 20th century Black radical thought. Dr. John is the current vice chair of the Society for Caribbean Studies. She's the coordinator of the Translating Blackness Project and a member of the Black British History Matters Working Group. She's also a member of the Caribbean film collective called Cinema One, and she's a historical lead for Insightful Black History, a community history project. Today, Dr. John's paper introduces the concept and characteristics of people's papers. These were locally owned newspapers which self-defined as by the people, for the people, and positioned themselves in narrative opposition to the better established planters' papers in the 1930s. And in so doing, they nurtured a crucial wave of Caribbean nationalism and a generation of nationalists. This is going to be really exciting. So I'm going to invite Dr. John to start. Please keep your questions in the chat, keep them for later. We're definitely going to have a Q&A after. But for now, I'd like to welcome Dr. John to tell us about this paper.
Thank you so much, Zakiya. That is a lovely intro. And thank you all for being here. So the paper I'm going to present today is going to consider the historical context slightly of the rise of what I call people papers. I'll be outlining the defining characteristics of these papers from the English and the French-speaking Caribbean and sharing about the people who created and wrote for them. And these, I use this term people papers because I found that helpful. But what we're talking really about is the radical press of the colonial Caribbean. So the 1920s and 1930s. It's part of a larger book project I'm working on, so I would really appreciate your thoughts and your feedback, and I'm looking forward to interacting in the Q&A. So I shall share my screen. That's the thing that you have to do at these things, but I completely forgot to do first. And then it will be... Did I just jump way too far? Okay. So the paradigm shift in Caribbean political life in the 1930s is arguably the outcome of several processes which began around 1915. That year, Theophilus Albert T.A. Marichaux founded the West Indian newspaper in Grenada, and that's often referred to by later Caribbean thinkers as the first nationalist Caribbean newspaper. A year earlier, in Jamaica in 1914, Amy Ashwood and Marcus Garvey had launched their Organization for Racial Uplift, the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League, and the newspaper that organization ran, the Negro World, would be key in facilitating the international reach of that movement. In 1917, the October Revolution's launch and the international communist movement it supported would soon insist that supporting anti-imperialist struggle was a condition of its membership, and that uncompromising position on colonialism no doubt attracted many early Caribbean nationalists to their ranks. In Martinique in 1917, it was the year that the group Jean Jaurès split from Joseph Lagosilière, the father of Martinican socialism as he's known, following his rather treacherous electoral pact with Martinique's factory owners. And the year after that, in 1918, the pioneering Guyanese trade unionist Hubert Critchlow began the process which would see the British Guiana Labour Union become in 1919 the first legally recognised trade union in the English-speaking Caribbean. Although they certainly hoped it would be the case, these protagonists could not have anticipated that the reverberation of precedents that they set in the Caribbean, around and across the Atlantic, and on occasion throughout the entire world. Despite challenges, these political actors and their organizations flourished, and some, like the UNIA and the Comintern, peaked in the 1920s, but the seeds sown bore significant fruit in the decade which followed. The Caribbean region of the early 1930s was home to a veritable explosion of popular and increasingly politically radical newspapers, from the Garvey-supporting The People in Trinidad and Tobago to the trade unionist Jamaica Labour Weekly, and many of the English and French-speaking colonies in between and beyond those colonies. Unapologetic, often aggressive advocates for the Caribbean's labouring classes, these new publications challenged, sometimes openly, the prestigious, long-established planter papers and the status quo, the plantocracy, which they represented. As the Barbados Observer announced in one of its earliest issues, the Observer is an independent journal dedicated to the interests of Barbados and the West Indies. It is in no way subservient to vested interests, and it has no party affiliations. As it has no party affiliations, there will be no antagonisms, prejudices, or jealousies. The party has no favourites to support, no enemies to placate, no favours to bestow. The new People papers encouraged and supported the growing militancy in the Caribbean. They highlighted the work of emerging leaders who denounced a corrupt colonial order, giving the activist columns and their activities coverage. In Justice, published in Martinique, there was a regular column written anonymously by an agricultural worker. In Guadeloupe's Le Cri du Peuple, A. Ducados, probably Saban Ducados, a prominent local trade unionist with links to the Communist International, had a regular column entitled La Voix Paysanne et Ouvrière, the peasant and worker voice. People papers discussed social and labor issues which affected the masses of predominantly Black working class Caribbean people, and cordially debated the relatively new yet influential ideas of Garveyism, trade unionism, socialism, and communism, and the organizations they generated. The relationship which developed between the papers and the movement is perhaps best articulated by a message from Adrian Colorienzi, which appeared in the first issue of the Vanguard, a new publication in January 1940. Rienzi, an Indo-Trinidadian radical barrister and communist.
Sorry to disrupt you. Can you just turn off your video for us? Because we're hearing you, but the bandwidth is a bit slow. So turn off your video, we'll watch the slides, but we can hear you, okay? Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Zakiya. I'm gonna say the last sentence again then. So, Rienzi, who was an Indo-Trinidadian radical barrister and communist, was a newly elected member of the Legislative Council and president of Trinidad's new Trade Union Congress. Oh, this is not moving. Friends and comrades, permit me to extend to you fraternal greetings through the medium of the Vanguard, the launching of which this new year marks a new phase in working class struggles in the history of the colony. As Rienzi implies, the radical press of the colonial Caribbean formed an integral part of the movements about which they wrote. People papers dedicated themselves to offering readers throughout the region a distinctive new race and class conscious perspective on local, regional, and international news in an explicit attempt to encourage, validate, and normalize the inclusion of the largely unenfranchised masses in local politics. A local press, what I sometimes refer to as planter papers, had been published regularly in the region for at least 200 years by the turn of the 20th century, and papers contesting their narratives also had precedent. In Barbados, The Liberal, published and edited by Samuel Jackman Prescott in the 1830s and the 1840s, had campaigned vociferously to ensure that emancipation would not be emptied of all meaning for the formerly enslaved. And in Jamaica, Dr. Robert Love, an immigrant originally from the Bahamas, edited the Jamaica Advocate in the 1890s, and he also appears to have been a key contact of Henry Sylvester Williams, when the latter attempted to establish local branches of the association which had successfully coordinated the 1900 Pan-African Conference in London. The arrival then of Grenada's The West Indian in 1915 marked the advent of the first wave of post-World War I people papers in the Caribbean. The Voice of St. Lucia, purchased by George Gordon in 1920. Justice, established by the group Jean Jaurès in 1920 as well. And the explicitly Garveyite papers, Le Flambeau, from 1923 in Martinique, and the Bermuda Recorder, established in 1925, were all, and the Bon Combat of Guadeloupe, were all papers established in the years immediately after 1918, with aims similar to Alfred Brownlow Place, the Bermudian co-founder and longtime editor of the Recorder, who helped to produce, and I quote, a newspaper in the interest of the colored people of Bermuda, end quote. Perhaps the single most distinguishing feature identifying a publication as a people paper was the expression of a strong solidarity with and consistent content highlighting the struggles and needs of the local laboring classes. Such interest in their society's largest yet most marginalized communities, who were overwhelmingly the descendants of captured and enslaved African peoples, was an unusual, deliberate political position.
Okay, I think we might have lost Dr. John there.
I'm back.
You're here, okay.
Sorry, where did I? Did you catch what my last sentence?
Yeah, so
back
from the single most distinguishing feature identifying a publication.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll continue. The single most distinguishing feature identifying a publication as a people paper was the expression of a strong solidarity with and consistent content highlighting the struggles and needs of the local laboring classes. Such an interest in their society's largest yet most marginalized communities, who were overwhelmingly the descendants of captured and enslaved African peoples, was an unusual, deliberate political positioning, which quickly became apparent.
Can you show us the slides again as well?
Oh.
Let's try with the slides one more time, okay? We do apologize for this. It's a really good paper though, it's worth it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for daring. Can you see the screen?
We can see it. Let's hear you.
That decision, or that interest, in the society's largest yet most marginalized communities, who were overwhelmingly the descendants of captured and enslaved African peoples, was an unusual, deliberate political positioning, which quickly became apparent. Such allegiance served to markedly differentiate them from the mainstream press, the planter papers, which, as the appellation suggests, tended to represent the interests of the plantocracy. Given the bounded nature of class and color in the Caribbean, the legacy of centuries of enslavement of African peoples, and which was quite firmly entrenched by the 1930s, the choice of topics of interest to their readerships, the relationship with imperial metropoles, and the absences, i.e. the topics and the points of view deemed not worth addressing within their pages, together.
Okay. I might see if we can get Dr. John to send us the slides, email the slides over to us. Can we do that, Eve? You think we can?
Unfortunately, the slides are really large. So I think what I'll suggest is that we get her back on and we just carry on without the slides.
Without the slides, okay.
Is that okay, everybody? I'm really sorry, but yeah, she's joining us. Where is she at the moment? She's in the Caribbean at the moment, isn't she?
I am back.
Kesewa, do you think it'd be okay if we just continue without the slides? Is that okay? Because it's just affecting the bandwidth and is just a bit of a problem. But it's a fantastic presentation. Please keep going. But I think I just recommend that we just keep going without them, I'm afraid.
Yeah, no, that's fine. That's fine.
Okay, well done, and just keep it up. We had one request.
And thank you everyone for your patience.
Yeah, I'm sorry to jump in. We had a request in the chat just saying, can you just speak a little bit more slowly for everybody, but that everybody's really enjoying it, and thank you.
Thank you. Oh dear, I'm sorry. Bounded nature of class and color in the Caribbean. The absences, the topics and points of view deemed not worth addressing within their pages, together produced distinct, intersecting class and race-based positions in both people and planter papers alike. New publications usually stated their objectives in the first or early issues. La Race Nègre, published in Paris, declared in the July 1935 issue that it wished for an end to imperial rule and racial discrimination. And I'll translate it for you. It says in English, "We want a single Black state encompassing the whole of Black Africa and the West Indies. And at the heart of that state, we will make the question of races what it was before, an element of diversity and happy competitions, and not a pretext for distasteful antipathies," end quote. This call for political unity, so central to the argument in La Race Nègre, which was the organ of the Ligue de Défense de la Race Nègre, one of France's most prominent left-wing Pan-Africanist organizations in the interwar period, was very much in line with the aims of La Voix des Nègres, published by the Comité de Défense de la Race Nègre, a Black communist organization headquartered in Paris, in January a few years earlier in 1927. The two organizations were linked. The League was created by former members of the Comité, and the demand for unification of the Caribbean and cross-linguistic divisions was an early feature through these organizations of demands for change in the colonial Caribbean. And I'll quote, "There are still some poor comedians in the service of capitalism and imperialism, willing to defend the stupid and ridiculous idea of assimilation of France's vieilles colonies, the old colonies, which refers to Martinique, Guadeloupe, Guyane, and La Réunion. We say independence for all colonial peoples, and we want Haiti, Dominica, Martinique, Guadeloupe, and the other neighboring islands to form the Federation of the West Indies." And that's published in 1927, an article called Pour l'Indépendance, for independence. The insistence that people racialized as different and more implicitly as inferior were in fact equal, and the explicit anti-imperialist position taken by the writers of La Race Nègre and La Voix des Nègres were political positions which differed dramatically from the political mainstream. Only a few years earlier, through the ratified covenant of the League of Nations, the world's most powerful countries had collectively accepted the white supremacist notion that some peoples were more advanced than others, and the others needed to be tutored in the ways of modernity for the foreseeable future. People papers were forthright and relentless in their querying of well-established but oppressive norms and ideas. A confrontational tone from the outset was perhaps logical for the organs of radical political groups. Other people papers began with moderate critiques and became much more critical and radical during the course of their print run. The Barbados Observer, for example, in January 1934, soon after its launch, printed an editorial stating, and I quote, "The character of a country's newspapers should be a revealing reflection of the character of public interest and of public thinking. It should patently mirror and not infrequently accentuate the deep divergencies of opinion and outlook in the community it serves. Today, Barbadians are thinking more and more. The Observer will endeavor to reflect and give prominence to the various shades of public opinion and thought without attempting to convert anybody to its way of thinking. It will endeavor to be friendly disposed to all, continuing to express its opinions with dignity, candid fearlessness, and fair play. The Observer will be a kaleidoscopic review of life today, its progress, politics, and whatnot. It will be accepted by the modern-minded, free-spending men and women of Barbados as their stimulating guide not only to the theatre, politics, and the latest games, but to the purchase of the highest grade commodities from smoking accessories to motor cars and houses." End quote. At the outset, then, the Observer positioned itself as a progressive liberal paper distinctly oriented towards the colony's middle classes. The masses, barely surviving on the poverty line, were not in the market for cars in 1933. Events, however, soon shifted it in the direction of the radicals. British equivocation on the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, for example, profoundly disappointed believers in British fair play and hardened the paper's tone considerably. With offices based in the center of the capital, Bridgetown, the Observer's editor and staff further became far more critical of the colonial regime after witnessing unprovoked fatal police violence firsthand during the uprisings, the labor rebellions of 1937. And by February 1939, the following statement permanently sat at the top of the editorial section. Quote, "The Observer is absolutely independent and fearless, offering no unkind or unjust criticism, treating opponents fairly on all questions, and giving vigorous and hearty support to movements for the public good. It is dedicated to the service of the people, in capital letters, that no good cause shall lack a champion, and that wrong will not thrive unopposed, end quote. A similar turn to more radical politics occurred in the Keys, the monthly publication of the League of Coloured People, which was founded in 1931 by Harold Moody, a family doctor in South London who had migrated from Jamaica. The League was one of the most prominent Black organisations in Britain in the interwar years. Earlier issues of the Keys were preoccupied with creating links between Black people and communities in various parts of the UK, and a decidedly middle-class, assimilationist, frankly paternalistic sensibility was evident. The annual garden party and a seaside excursion for poor and Black mixed children, for poor Black and mixed children in residential care homes were particular highlights of the League of Coloured People's social calendar and important to the community it served. Yet again, in the wake of the Italian aggression towards Ethiopia, the tenor of the Keys changed drastically. While continuing to celebrate Black achievement and maintaining its commitment to supporting Britain's Black poor and mixed children, the League and its publication became aligned quite unequivocally with the liberation struggles of Black working people worldwide. Caroline Bressie has argued that the League's influence peaked in 1943, when 500 people attended a meeting in Liverpool which drew up a Charter for Coloured People, whose text explicitly demanded self-government for people living under colonial rule, and an end to discrimination in service provision and employment, and the need for gender and racial equality. So how frequently did these radical ideas appear in print? Well, People papers typically appeared weekly. Exceptions were the Voice of St. Lucia, which appeared 3 times a week, and the twice-weekly Nouvelliste de Guadeloupe in the early 1930s. Some, like the Keys, the Negro Worker, and the Cri de Nègre, were monthly organs of Black organizations. Most People papers appeared to have sold thousands of copies of each issue. The maximum print run appeared to be about 20,000 copies. In countries where the population typically numbered less than a few 100,000 before 1950, and where the reading culture meant that a single newspaper may have been read aloud to one or maybe several groups of people, a circulation of 5,000 suggests quite a high degree of penetration. And the number of copies sold regularly increased over time. In 1937, Trinidad and People informed its readers that the publication would be moving offices to accommodate the increasing demand for 20,000 copies of every edition. Roxanne Watson has estimated that the Gleaner, which she considered the most influential paper in Jamaica in the 1930s, at that same time had a circulation of about 25,000 copies of each issue sold. As People papers, it seems, were wildly popular. In an interview with Martinican historian Armand Nicolas, his face lit up at the mention of Le Cri des Nègres, the People paper published in Paris, but according to Nicolas, sold everywhere in Martinique in the 1930s and 40s. Ironically, quite very little is known about most of the people who edited, wrote, and otherwise worked at People papers. Well-known journalists like Paulette Nardal and George Padmore were quite rare. Even those papers which are still in print do not appear to maintain their own archive. While private holdings may yet reveal a great deal, the newspapers consulted for this study were almost entirely only available through official state-run repositories such as national libraries or archives or both. And a further hindrance to identifying contributors is that a significant number of the columns were actually written under pseudonyms, names like Pertinax, Progressive, L'Œil de Moscow, the Eye of Moscow, and the Field Organizer, to name but a few. Given the frank, bold tone and prescient analysis commonly found within the pages of People papers, when discussing local issues and injustices, and the frequent references to sedition laws, it may be deduced that pseudonyms and low profiles were a means of minimizing any backlash, either official or unofficial, to their content, either for the writers or for their friends and families. This was, it must be remembered, the geopolitical era during which Malcolm Nelson was known as George Padmore, C.L.R. James began writing political theory as J.R. Johnson, and Chris Brathwaite and Claudia Cumberbatch both adopted the surname Jones. Beyond their names and positions as editors and or proprietors listed in and about the paper section, most editors of People papers maintained a low profile even within their papers' pages. It's lamentable for historians because through reading their content, it is clear that People papers tended to have a single, often visionary editor for the duration of this period. While some, like the Black Man, appear to have been the mouthpiece of a single individual who contributed the majority of the articles, others, such as the People in Trinidad, the Barbados Observer, and the Bermuda Recorder, maintained an office and may have employed a dozen or more people. Most were popularly acclaimed. Most were popularly acclaimed for their work as journalists and editors, amplifying the interests of the unenfranchised majority, and were known and even lauded by their peers at people papers in other countries. Furthermore, historians of the period have frequently commented on the importance of the newspapers of the day, in both relaying events accurately and recording the demands and interests of the Caribbean's masses. Stenet Kerr Coombs of Jamaica and Uche Martino Tanta of Guadeloupe had in common an unusually fearless yet personal editorial style, which marked the pages of their newspapers, the Jamaica Labour Weekly and La Volonté, respectively. Their editorials featured prominently on the front page, and they directly addressed the producers of planter papers. They were both remarked upon for their confrontational tone, and they were both sanctioned for it heavily. Coombs' editorship paused when he spent 6 months in prison for seditious libel, but he was supported and applauded by the people for whom he spoke. The better recognized editors of people papers are those who gained renown in other fields. Winter Crawford, founder and editor of the Barbados Observer, for example, was elected to the Barbados legislature in 1940, representing the parish of St. Philip, and was a prominent politician for several decades. He participated in Barbados's independence negotiations in London and later served in the cabinet of Errol Barrow, Barbados's first prime minister post-independence. Crawford nevertheless remains a lesser-known example. Other editors of people papers include intellectual icon C.L.R. James, who's the likely co-editor with George Padmore of Africa and the World, The African Sentinel, and International Opinion, early Black feminist broadcaster and poet Una Marson, who edited The Keys, and Nobel Prize-winning economist Sir Arthur Lewis, who was Markson's successor at The Keys. A more notorious case is that of André Aliker, editor of the communist newspaper Justice, whose expose of corruption in colonial Martinique led directly to his murder. L'affaire Aliker, or the Aliker affair, remains one of Martinique's most contentious unsolved murders, and the incredible story was dramatized in a feature film in 2009. George Gordon worked around the Caribbean before returning home and purchasing and editing The Voice of St. Lucia in 1920. George Gordon, who shaped one of the few people papers still in print today, has been largely forgotten. His son, Garnet Gordon, however, took over editing The Voice upon his father's death in 1940. Sir Garnet Gordon, a barrister, was a leading politician in the years after World War II and engaged in Caribbean politics both in the region and the UK. Garnet Gordon was a founder member of St. Lucia's People's Progressive Party, along with newspaper rival John Pilgrim, editor of the West Indian Crusader, who had spent several years in Panama until the early 1920s. And Garnet Gordon was also a member of the delegation which negotiated associated statehood for St. Lucia in 1967, the precursor to independence, and was a judge at the Caribbean Beauty Contest, which formed part of the first carnival in London, organized by Trinidadian communist and feminist Claudia Jones in 1959. Similarly transcontinental, T.A. Marichaux, the founder and editor of Grenada's first people paper, the West Indian, worked closely with the International African Service Bureau in London in the 1930s. He served as the honorary president of the Caribbean Legal Congress, based in Jamaica in the late 1940s as well. Communist Stefan Rosso and Narcisse Danai being the author of the text I read earlier for independence, both edited and contributed to people papers in Guadeloupe, Le Bon Combat, and Le Cri du Peuple, respectively, before arriving in France, where they engaged with Black radicalism, and where Rosso in particular continued to write radical texts. Fellow Guadeloupean Max Clanville-Blancourt had been a former founder member of the French Communist Party in 1920. With future Vietnamese political leader Ho Chi Minh, he co-led the Union Anti-Colonial in 1920s Paris, a recruitment and training ground for anti-imperialist activists from across the French Empire. Clanville-Blancourt co-edited Le Paria, the Union Intercolonial's newspaper, and also co-founded Messager Dahomeyen, the Dahomeyan Messenger, a newspaper edited by early nationalist Louis Hunkarin. I don't know if I said that right. Max Clenville-Blancourt was connected to almost every Black radical organization in Paris throughout the 1920s, until he returned to Guadeloupe in 1930, just in time to play a leading role in the labor rebellion there that year. At the same time, he was identified as an editor of another radical newspaper, Concentration, copies of which now appear to be lost. Blancourt was later reportedly elected to office in Pointe-à-Pitre, Guadeloupe Central City. With this whistle-stop tour of some of the key figures associated with People papers, I hope it's clear that despite the observer's endeavor to simply reflect and give prominence to the various shades of public opinion and thought without attempting to convert anybody to its way of thinking, and that's a quote, it is evident that many People papers were either forged into or envisaged as intensely political instruments essential for advocating for the Caribbean's laboring classes, whether they were published at home in the Caribbean or abroad. Widespread popular education was an innovation, really, of the second half of the 20th century in most of the French and English-speaking Caribbean. Although Lara Putnam has estimated literacy rates in the period as between 25 and just over 50% for much of the English-speaking Caribbean, and significantly higher for those who had migrated. As such, it may be deduced that those with enough learning to produce or contribute to newspaper articles and debates in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s were among the relatively privileged few well-educated Afro-Caribbean people. Education up to university level was comparatively rare in this period, but the quality and the references within the journalism and People papers suggest that their contributors were usually very well educated and very well informed. A significant number had traveled when seeking work opportunities within the region or further afield, typically to Panama, Cuba, England, France, the US, and/or Canada. And several of the contributors were also writers with serious literary ambitions, such as the Harlem Renaissance star Eric Walrond, who contributed to The Black Man, poet Una Marson, who I've mentioned already, is associated with the Keys, the Herald of Barbados, which was led by Colonel Wickham, and who also edited The Outlook with the express intention of developing Caribbean creative writing in the early 1930s, and Paulette Nardal, who contributed to La Dépêche Africaine and edited La Revue du Monde Noir, and the titles of those are Review of the Black World. And I don't know how you translate La Dépêche Africaine. I'll leave that.
Dr. John, we're just about 25 minutes, okay?
Thank you.
All right.
Dedicated to journalism, which educated, informed, and represented the Caribbean masses, most of the editors and some of their contributors engaged directly with local political groupings. A notable number had been card-carrying members or sympathizers of Caribbean chapters of the UNIA, including Colonel Wickham, editor of the Barbados Herald and later the West Indian, of Grenada, Alfred Mendes, editor of Jamaica's Plain Talk, Leonard Fitzgerald Walcott, editor of The People in Trinidad and Tobago, and the Bermuda Recorder's Alfred Brownlow Place, and St. Lucia's John Pilgrim, who had edited the West Indian Crusader, was also a latent Garveyite. Most People papers express sympathy with the movement's aim, in particular of restoring dignity to Afro-Caribbean people, and the papers are filled with reverence for Marcus Garvey as a respected and established leader. They took a variety of positions with regard to local electoral positions. Some were, like Plain Talk, a committed Alexander Bustamante paper, and Lucrece Perp and the Perp supporters for Guadeloupean politician Hégise P. Legitimus actively promoted the work of a particular leader. Others, such as Justice, promoted a political program of a political party and their candidates at election. The avowedly socialist Nouvelliste was rare in its affiliation to a particular political philosophy. Most People papers supported individual candidates that they deemed worthy during an election cycle, but they more frequently engaged with the work of local community organizations. In the 1930s, income and property qualifications ensured that perhaps only 10% of the adult population had access to the franchise in the English-speaking colonial Caribbean. In the French colonial Caribbean, by contrast, universal male suffrage had been established at the abolition of enslavement in 1848. Many politicians therefore used newspapers to express their opinions, to explain their positions, and build and maintain support among their constituents. Once elected to the French Assembly, often relocating to France to be there, many representatives of France's Caribbean populations were very rarely resident in the Caribbean. Local newspapers dedicated to their work in the French Parliament meant they remained in touch with their population, or more precisely, that their population were less apt to forget them between elections. Overall, however, by definition, people papers encouraged and supported trade unionism. They anticipated that means and this in reality meant they anticipated and universally supported the labor rebellions and frequently the leaders who emerged from that moment. In addition to publishing original local journalism, people papers regularly reprinted stories from papers in other colonies. Sometimes news stories were first published in a local paper, then reprinted in another country's paper. At other times, it was not clear where the article originated, but it appeared in different countries. In such cases, a reader of their own locally produced newspaper would not necessarily be aware that an article was being circulated across the region's papers. And an important example of this is the Manifesto Against War, which appeared in the October 1938 issue of International African Opinion, the monthly organ of the London-based International African Service Bureau, led by George Padmore. Convincingly citing quarrels between the Axis and Allied powers over access to colonies as the true but unspoken source of the dispute, the article offered a radical different interpretation of the causes of World War II. Initially published in the UK, then reprinted with almost identical text in Guyana's Labour Advocate in April 1939, and then significantly reworked before being republished after the declaration of war, this time in the crisis in the US in November 1939. The circuitous publishing history of the Manifesto Against War highlights the networks within the world of people papers, which extended at least through the Caribbean, Europe, and North America. They operated within a larger network of radical Caribbean journalism, as the Traveller of the Manifesto demonstrates, and some relationships between papers are more easily ascertained. An article by Eric Walrond, The Negro in London, was originally published in London in The Black Man, but it was also later republished by The People. Both were Garvey-supporting papers. The West Indian Crusader, published in St. Lucia, frequently republished articles first published in the Barbados Observer. The Guyana Review reprinted from International African Opinion, and the Antigua and the Magnet republished articles from the West Indian Crusader. This was kind of easier when you could see the pictures of the newspapers. I'm sorry, it's just a list now. But the Bermuda Recorder, the Voice of St. Lucia, the Barbados Observer, and the West Indian Crusader all shared news from the people. And the Barbados Observer republished articles from the Bermuda Recorder, and the Voice of St. Lucia, and the West Indian Crusader reprinted articles from the Observer. Martinican, Guadeloupean, and Jamaican people papers appeared most isolated from this cross-publishing practice. Jamaica's people papers regularly reported on current events in their larger independent neighbors, Haiti and Cuba, and also republished George Padmore's journalism several times. But they far more really covered news stories from other parts of the English-speaking Caribbean, and no references to the French-speaking colonial Caribbean were noted during the course of this study. Martinican and Guadeloupean papers were most likely to republish articles about their sister Francophone isle. They printed stories from the English-speaking Caribbean occasionally, but like the Jamaican papers, were generally more prone to covering Caribbean people's activity in the UK and France than in other parts of the Caribbean. This doesn't mean that editors in Jamaica, Martinique, and Guadeloupe did not keep abreast of Caribbean current affairs. For example, within weeks of the outbreak of the 1937 labor rebellion in Trinidad, the Martinican publication Justice published a message of support in an article titled "To Our Trinidadian Comrades," suggesting engagement with and a concern for similar struggles taking place in other parts of the region. And I'll very briefly read the quote. "The Martinican Communist Branch respectfully salutes the memory of our comrades, the workers of Trinidad, fallen under the bullets of police in the service of the capitalist ruling class. It energetically protests against the attitude of the government of Trinidad, which instead of calmly and rationally discussing the demands of our comrades, responded to them with savage and brutal repression. In the name of the Martinican working class, which is also familiar with the painful experience of shootings, Our communist branch expresses its solidarity with our comrades from Trinidad in their fight for better living conditions. And that's from the 8th of July, 1937. In the Caribbean, French and English-speaking people papers thus interacted in infrequent but interesting ways. Most papers embraced the concept of an emergent West Indian identity rooted in the shared experiences of the region's working class. They practiced regional cooperation through the network of editors and sister papers, reprinting and sharing news originally printed in other regional publications, as well as from compatriots writing and living outside the region. And I'm going to conclude. When uprisings began to shake the centuries-old social and political order from 1930 onwards, people papers reported on the rebellions as they happened across the Caribbean and provided a wealth of information and analysis on events in their own countries, sometimes at great personal risk. In an era of consistent serious upheaval, where laborers clashed with the owners of the means of production, the narratives of the newspapers was important, and the planter versus people papers is an important if simplistic distinction to making societies divided along those lines. Today, I've outlined what I call people papers and some of the lesser known members of the collective thinkers behind them. Conceptualizing people papers proved incredibly useful for me when seeking out published source material which would enrich a study of interwar radical intellectual thought in the Caribbean. Newspapers and editors which were willing to face disapproval, censorship, and even prison because they intended to produce content for the people and in their interests, who represented the numerical majority of a given Caribbean colony, but were largely ignored and or marginalized at best by colonial administrators and elites alike, were rare. Most colonies were home to but one such publication in this period. Looking at different sites, however, a picture emerges of a vibrant regional intellectual and political community which crossed traditional linguistic and geographical limitations, became increasingly connected, and which held dear shared values which evolved into a clear political position over the course of the decade. As West Indian-ness was embraced as a concept for the majority, so did people papers grow in influence and confidence over the decade, and they formed a currently understudied but key role in the workers' movement, which transformed the region and led quite directly towards decolonization in the Caribbean. Dozens of newspapers served various interest groups in the period of the people papers I've studied. La Flamme in Martinique, for example, was the organ defending the interests of Great War veterans. And Charles Schiele has recently published La Forge de Zobel, an edited collection of the journalistic writings of acclaimed novelist Joseph Zobel in Le Sportif, a newspaper which sought to promote the spread of physical education and sport. Satirical newspapers, liberal, moderate, even right-wing political newspapers, literary criticism, religious, historical, and economic press were all regularly published in Martinique alone. Historian Edouard de Lupin has calculated there were around 100 publications touching on all subjects appearing regularly in 1930s Martinique, serving a population of around 250,000 people. People papers then can be considered just a small slice of a vibrant Caribbean press towards the end of the classic colonial era, yet the part which was proactively pushing that era to its death. I'm sorry about the technical difficulties, but thank you very much for bearing with us.
Thank you very much. Wonderful paper. Don't worry. I think just hearing it alone, it's very rich. And I have a bunch of questions to ask you. And I'm sure people will come through with more questions. We do have one question from Maria Clara asking the name of the Martinican newspaper again. Is this Justice in support of Trinidad in 1937? Can you tell us a little bit about it?
I don't have much more than that. Justice is a famous communist paper. It's still in print. It's one of the few papers that is still in print today. They're founded in 1920. They come out of the split I mentioned right at the beginning between these two big figures of Martinican socialism, Joseph Lagorozilier and Jules Monoro. And Jules Monoro leads this group away after Lagorozilier makes a pact, an electoral pact, to win a seat, basically, with the factory owners. Should I keep talking about it, or
no, that's great. I think we answered the question. I think we just wanted the name even. So okay, we have another question from Maria Clara. Thank you. Is there any particular role played by literature authors such as Césaire or Zobel that you in these publications?
So Zobel is an interesting one because he writes in the Sportif. I didn't find the Sportif until after I'd kind of finished the study, because I didn't kind of naturally go to what is on the surface, kind of a newspaper about sports. But I know that he does write for them. Césaire writes for Tropique. I don't. It was so. To be clear, when I first started this study, I was looking particularly at newspapers between 1920 and 1940, and Tropique began publication in 1942, I think. And so it was just slightly out of my time zone. So I haven't looked at it in detail, but he did write in Tropique from like 1942 to I think 1944 with his wife, Suzanne Césaire.
Yeah, and just thinking about my own research. So in London, I know that for sure you had a lot of the literature, the creative writers who were writing in the what Kesewa would call the people's papers as well. So you had like Carew, and you would have articles from kind of all of the writers who were also publishing at the time, Walcott, Una Marson as well, as you mentioned. They would also be writing in the newspapers that were kind of same radical tradition, but they would be printing social commentary quite often, and sometimes their poetry and stuff. I'm going to ask you a question, and we have a question coming. I'm going to ask you one, and if we don't leave it, I will ask you all the questions to help me finish my PhD. But I was thinking about some of your other work that I know I'm privy to, and this work here. And I know before, we're talking about Black spaces and Black newspapers. And so right here, I know you mentioned people's papers is what you definitely say. But we're talking about Blackness as well. But I am interested in knowing, so West India and Caribbean, there are, multitude of people there. So I'm interested in the spaces and how kind of writing the newspapers and identity came into, if that identity came into these questions of writing, because they definitely come up in London for sure, because there's a clash of so much other things. And it's also the space where, as you mentioned, West Indian kind of became a thing when you had all the people coming together and recognizing. And I know that Claudia Jones's newspaper started out as the West Indian Gazette, and from backlash from that, she had to add Afro-Asian Caribbean news, and that Asian was very important, right, for her. So I'm just wondering if there was anything like that in the Caribbean itself, where kind of the identities might have been accepted already or known for a much longer time than when they came to London.
That's a really good question. So in terms of how people understand West Indianness, that's something that people papers actively kind of promote. So they have like West Indian news and views section. Different papers will kind of encourage engagement with the Caribbean. They'll follow what's happening in other islands. And like I mentioned, that was quite common across the thing. And it was the exception that Jamaica, Martinique, and Guadeloupe weren't kind of having that practice. The rest of them are very much engaged with what's happening elsewhere. They republished articles from each other. They talk about what's happening. And they do it sometimes quite tactically. So when Grenada, the governor in Grenada donates money to the ambulance fund, there's a letter in a People paper in Trinidad to the governor. The governor in Grenada donated to their fund. So they're very kind of proactive about engaging and recognizing themselves as kind of part of a broader contingent of Caribbean people, definitely what they call West Indian. Yes. You asked another question. Is that was part of that?
No, I think that's for me. Oh, go ahead.
Okay. Is this about the Afro, in terms of the Afro-Indo kind of questions? That's a really interesting thing during this period. So there's a lot of, to be honest, solidarity. And there's this kind of, a lot of work being done to kind of break through racial barriers. So I mentioned Adrian Coda-Rienzi, who's an Indo-Trinidadian, but he's got a very close relationship with the people, and they support him massively when it comes to election. They're like, he's the guy. And there's a real strong sense of kind of, even though they have sometimes different battles, for example, like in the Hindu, one of the things that Hindus are fighting for, I think in Guyana, but possibly also in Trinidad, is to have their marriages recognized, to have the right to speak their own languages, which are not things that the Afro-Guyanese or Trinidadians are necessarily, sort of, it's not their issue, if you like, but they're supporting it. When the invasion of Ethiopia happens and the people have this massive campaign in support of Ethiopia, they have this big service where this imam talks about how Gandhi says we must support African brothers. And so there's a lot of kind of solidarity, very proactive, very kind of, and they're very kind of sensitive, I think, or I say proactive, they're kind of almost aware that they shouldn't have racial divisions, and they're very kind of clear about that, building those.
Great.
And as Mr. Moore says, yes, Rienzi was the legal counsel for Uriah Butler in 1937 as well.
Okay. So we have a question from Rachel Douglas. Thanks, Rachel. She says, brilliant paper. I was interested in the publishing history of certain documents being significantly reworked. She knows that C.L.R. James first mentioned Louverture and the Haitian Revolution in the Beacon, published in 1931. Do you work on the Beacon as well? And have you, she's managed to find it reprinted by Krauss, republished by Krauss reprints. Yeah. And so do you work on the Beacon in any way? Has it come up in your work? It hasn't.
It hasn't come up. It hasn't come up. I'm sorry. Yeah, I think I probably would have skipped so just to be really clear on methodology, because I think it's kind of important to some of these questions. Almost none of these papers exist online. The Bermuda Recorder is really exceptional in that you can go on the Google. So to find these newspapers is literally like a trip to Barbados to spend time in the archives to dig out issues of the Observer, which means that there's a limit to how much you can really do. So for example, I was particularly interested in finding out how the Barbados Observer responded to the Ethiopian crisis. I went there twice. I spent like a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and I still didn't catch everything that the Barbados Observer recorded. I just couldn't in the time I had. So there are gaps in this research. It's very much a developing thing. It's still to be done, and it meant that I was quite picky about the newspapers that I could. There had to be a newspaper that was really gunning for the working class. It was really passionate. It was consistent. And I mentioned at the end that it sometimes might seem that it's a simplistic division to talk about people and planter papers, but it was possible to do that because the discourses are so different, and also because if there were newspapers like, for example, the Gleaner, which sometimes might have a supportive article in it, but it's not consistently every edition published, and so I wouldn't class it as a people paper, even if you could find examples of very supportive texts.
Yeah, and I mean, the Gleaner started publishing in the UK. They brought out a London edition, and I would say that a lot of the kind of newspapers that came out from London actually came out just to oppose the Gleaner, because the Gleaner was seen as the mouthpiece of the Colonials, the mouthpiece of the planters, straight up. So a lot of the papers that came out from the Gleaner. So I'm going to ask.
And it's from you, Zakiya, that I learned that the Bermuda Recorder was actually a response to the Negro World being cancelled. They tried to block it, and I didn't know that. I just knew it started. I didn't know it was a direct response to the suppression of the Negro worker. Yeah, the Negro World. Sorry. Nice
work going on between us. Lots of questions coming in now. So, did you come across the name Lucy? I think, is it Tessie, or is it supposed to be Therese? I'm not sure. Or Simone Yoyet, associated with any of the papers in your research from Martinique? So, Lucy Tessie and Simone Yoyet.
Those names don't ring a bell.
Yoyot, actually, they're in the chats.
Oh,
Simone Yoyot, is it? I'm going to put them right back at the bottom.
Okay, Lucy Tessie. No, these names don't ring a bell, but I'd love to hear if you know something about them that I don't. I'm always, I'm a shameless plug. If you know more about the people behind these papers, I'd love to talk to you. It's really hard to find information about them.
We have another, I just lost it. Okay, Naina has a question. Thank you. She says, what an interesting paper. Thank you, Kesewa. Are there references to Barbadian and Trinidadian sailors or seamen and their issues, struggles in any of these people's papers?
Absolutely.
Particularly since shipping was dominated by the British and the French companies at the same time as when Garvey started the Black Star Line.
Very much so. So I mentioned Chris Brathwaite, who is a sailor, and he had been a part of the Seamen's Minority Movement. I'm probably saying that wrong, but an organization literally about defending the workers of seamen. And seamen play a massive part in sharing these newspapers. They often face repression. They often face sometimes they're thrown in the sea. They have all sorts of terrible things that happen. They're really difficult to actually disperse, and seamen, as they're called, seafarers, I suppose is a more gender neutral term, are key in smuggling them. So even newspapers that are kind of less obviously radical, and I'll take the example of the Revue du Monde Noir, published in Paris by Paulette Nardal, which on the surface is just a literary text, but there's an issue which the French catch and they dump all the copies in the sea. And this isn't one of the ones that's kind of insisted on trade unionism. It's calling for revolution. And a lot of these papers aren't. A lot of the time they're just kind of saying, our interests are not like theirs. A lot of the time, particularly I talked about the tone after Ethiopia. A lot of that is about deciding kind of having these conversations in the public sphere about our interests aligned with the British government's, because it seems like we think this is an issue of right or wrong, and it's a very clear issue, and they seem to think this is okay to not act unfairly. And you really see how the shift kind of occurs when people are like, I don't think we have the same interest anymore. And it's a fascinating thing to see. Sorry, I'm talking to me.
Thank you. No, you definitely, you actually answered the second part of Nina's question. So we have a question from Lorraine. Hi, Lorraine. Questions. Lorraine is very pleased that you've clarified your methodology, because she was wondering how you chose your papers. Her research is on newspapers and journals from St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And she heard you say that many articles were shared between the islands. Did you see anything pertaining to St. Vincent and the Grenadines in your research?
So St. Vincent and the Grenadines is a really interesting one. They had a people paper called The Times, which Edward Cox has written about quite extensively, because in the months leading up to the Labour Rebellion in 1935, it had a campaign, Grimble Must Go. Grimble was the name of the administrator, who was deeply unpopular and sounds like he wasn't a very good one, to be honest, and didn't take criticism well. And at the moment of the Labour Rebellions, it suddenly disappeared from circulation. Okay. And across the Caribbean, people realized, hang on a second, what happened? They have this new emergency law, state of emergency legislation, which explicitly bans seditious literature. And the Times of St. Vincent, they're not mucking about. They've published a page, censored, published another page, censored. They're like, sorry, didn't have enough time to do something different, so there's just blank columns. And the other thing, I don't know if it came across, but people papers, one of my students said not backwards and coming forwards, and that's exactly how they are. They're really, really bold. It's really fascinating to see how self-confident they are as voices of people. Getting carried away. St. Vincent, yes, and so Colonel Wickham is in Grenada, and he's a really important journalist from this period from Barbados. He's had his paper shut down for being too bold in Barbados, and Marichaud gives him a job editing the West Indian, which is based in Grenada, and he moves there. And in 1935, maybe 2 days after the Labour Rebellions break out in Grenada, he goes and he sends reports which cannot be published in Grenada, in St. Vincent, back to Grenada. So I know that much about St. Vincent.
Thank you. Let me see if we have any more questions there. I have more. And I'll look. Does anyone have their hand up? You can also ask your question live if you'd like to. I'm just checking to see if we have any hands up at the moment, or turn your video on if you would like to speak. If not, I just want to go back to, you were speaking about the archives a second ago and saying that, you have to kind of go to them and they're not digitized. So my question to you is, what about the archives, and what's your perspective on where they should be or how they should be held, right? Is it a criticism of the archives being held or that you visited in the Caribbean? And is it a criticism of them being held by the state or other organized institutions and they're not being accessible? Now, I ask this question because, of course, my research is on these, Caribbean newspapers in London, and all the archives are actually for the most part, they're here in the UK. And when speaking to like my counterparts in the Caribbean, they go, that's not fair. Like, we want to see these papers. We should have them as well. You had to go to the Caribbean state. So just asking your question, what's your kind of view on archives and the holdings of Caribbean history and our kind of history that we want to research? What's your view on all of it, the state of it all?
I actually really enjoyed going to the different archives in the Caribbean. I think it's important that I went, because it meant not only did I go and visit the spaces, not only did I see the documents, but I saw the spaces that they kept in. I saw the places where people walked, where was the march held. Well, it was on that road. I was able to kind of really locate the stories that I was reading about in real time in real places. And it also meant I could visit with scholars, I could meet local historians, bookstore owners. It meant I could fully engage with the spaces that I was writing about. And I actually think that was an important part of the research. It was an important part of the research. Should papers be wherever? I think Caribbean studies is quite a difficult one in that respect because people have papers in all sorts of places. So one of the founders, one of the organizers, or the organizer, I suppose, of the 1932 Roseau Conference recognized it as massively important thing is his papers are not in Dominica, his papers are in the Schomburg Center in New York. And so I think one of the reasons that we struggle in Caribbean studies sometimes is because documents are all over the place. And one of the reasons why I think sometimes we don't find, I think one of the issues we have in Caribbean studies, in Caribbean history, is that people live in different places and their papers can be scattered in different places as a result. And so we don't kind of adhere to kind of traditional nation boundaries. And I think that makes our research complicated, but it also is life. People move around and their papers kind of are all over the place. And I don't think in and of itself is a problem. I do think not having access to them is a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think if you're a UK repository holding the archives of the Caribbean people, you should be thinking about digitizing and making them available to Caribbean people based in the region. Absolutely. I think as a position, I think that's reasonable. And I can't imagine anyone would be against it. And I think that's probably what I would say.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you so much. Question from Michael. He says, "Hi, Kesewa, I love this. You alluded to this in the paper, but I'm curious about reading practices. Like the group Jean Jaurès subscribe. Did they subscribe to Le Paria and hang around together in Port-au-Prince, reading it together? And did they talk with Christine about heading out to town to talk to the plantation workers? Do you have a sense of how these people papers circulated beyond the literate communities?"
So the group Jean Jaurès is a really great example because they were out there like absolutely trying to organize. And to be honest, most of them these are not newspapers, these are not literary papers. They're papers that are really about, they've got articles about how to organize a trade union. You know, this is the step, you do this, you do this, you do that. Have you joined a trade union yet? They've got columns by trade unions. So they're very keen on organizing. The editor, Andre Aliquet, was famous for like giving these rousing speeches and trying to get people to come into Fort-de-France and talk. Emma Francois, who's in Trinidad, she's a big talker as well. And she gets people, and she's always covered in the People. So the newspapers are a part of the movement. They're not separate from it, is the feeling I get. They have a particular purpose in that they report on it. But I'll give you an example. In St. Lucia in 1935, there's an article in the Voice of St. Lucia about a meeting that's going to take place in support of Ethiopia. And they print in full, like a whole page, for the resolution in support of Ethiopia. They're going to pass at this meeting at this time, at this place, you should come. In the article, it mentions that the organizing committee for the meeting is the editor of the newspaper, another editor of an editor of the rival paper, and then two other people. So there's 4 people on the organizing committee, and 2 of them are newspaper editors. And then in the next issue of the newspaper, they publish what happened at the meeting. So there's this kind of, it's a very kind of wholesale package. And that's one example, but that doesn't happen so rarely as well. Like they report on events that they attend, they talk about the speeches that they gave. But also they're part of the movement. They're not separate from it, I think is a really important distinction to make.
Yeah, I would say the same in London as well for the papers. I mean, you talk about the Keys, where my research basically starts, and you have writers from the Keys who then worked on the Caribbean News, who then worked on Claudia Jones's West Indian Gazette. And I mean, this is the kind of timeline of the papers, and they go from West Indian Gazette to the West Indian World up until we get to The Voice, and The Voice is the paper that we still have today, but it's the same kind of writers. We can trace them mentoring or giving each other jobs, or, one had a column here, who it was this person who wrote it this day, going back to the Keys, where, if we stretch further, we in the Caribbean. Eve, you had a question. Do you want to ask your question, Eve? You want to come on camera? Great.
Hi, yeah, I think you might have mentioned it right at the end, actually, I really love the way that you talk about the archives and talk about how that kind of interaction and the not just of the archives with people and people's experiences, and kind of how that is also an organic experience. And I just really like that, because I think that's so important. And I think at the end you may have mentioned something about sorry, the sentence cut off for me, but you talked about the need to digitize documents and make sure that they're available. But I'm also quite hesitant. This isn't my, I'm not claiming this is my area of expertise, but I do worry about what we lose then from digitizing archives as well. And that's certainly not the argument to say that we should not do that. But particularly in, you know, the era that we're living in at the moment, how people, and I'm seeing this with students that I engage with as well, how there's this tendency just to go online and just assume that everything's there, and then they're losing that relationship with the archives and that closeness as well to the archives. And sometimes, because if you're looking for a certain keyword or a specific subject or subcontext, you miss out on so much. So I just wondered if you had I think you already answered it basically by the time I asked my question, but I just wondered if you could add anything more about that personal relationship that you built with the archives, and what you think that brought to you, really, in terms of not just the research, but I think in in terms of as a person as well, what that brought to you, and what engagement and richness you got from that.
I mean, I think I got to situate the research in proper context. For me, I think that was really important, because I was talking to local people who remembered things. So I probably should mention that my grandma is still alive, and she remembers the Labour rebellions in Barbados. She was a child of like 10, and she remembers like gunshots. So a lot of people her age are still around, and old people have like loads and loads and loads of stories that if you tap into them, they're willing to share. And they're still a vital kind of oral history source. And I think not everyone's as old as my grandma. She's not that old, I want to point out. But like, I think that's really valuable to, and I didn't anticipate that, to be honest. It's something that at the start of the research, you're like, hang on a second, what, you remember what? I was interviewing someone, they were like, oh no, I was there. What? I thought you just wrote about it. Like, no, I was a part of the community, I was part of that group. I was like, oh wow, okay, because they looked really good for their age. I hadn't realized how old they were, basically. So I think, yeah, that's probably what I would say. In terms of the digitization question, I'm actually not that big a fan of digitization, because what I learned through this project is microfilm lasts forever. And so like, it's more like it's easier to store. And so we were talking about sort of making the archives accessible, but I think microfilm is, like, a lot of historians hate it, but I personally am a fan. Like, you can record so much on like a little thing that big. It's easy to store, like it, and it lasts apparently forever. And so, and in ways that digital technology is not that guaranteed. Like, these newspapers are preserved on microfilms, a lot of them. And you can put them in a computer and look at them as PDFs and save them as PDFs. But yeah,
I want to congratulate you on your paper, just because that came across so much. It's like you're talking about a living organism, really, and that's what's so lovely when we're hearing you talk. I know that a couple of the people have put in the chat that they wanted to see the slides. I don't know if you wanted to try and get them up and just maybe go through them so we can even see the images. And if the sound doesn't work, then at least we've got an appreciation of that. But that really came through, and it was just really vibrant and just a really, really exciting discussion. So let's see.
Thank you. There you go. I feel like you are gonna be slightly disappointed they're not that exciting, but they're just a little bit of visual for you. Okay, so this is the Vanguard. It's published in Trinidad from 1940. Vanguard is really interesting because it is a paper of the South. So the People is kind of the main paper. It's the main paper in Trinidad, or the main people paper in Trinidad, and it's based in Port of Spain. Whereas the Vanguard is supposed to represent it. It's not the oil workers and trade. It's not that. It's not connected to the union, but it's a different group, basically. And yet they kind of thank the people for having carried the struggle this far when they first kind of when they first start publication. So they kind of see themselves from the outset as kind of continuing and expanding on the work of the people, and being a part of the struggle. Okay, so these are the papers that come out in 1920. You've got the sort of first wave. You've got the West Indian, which is even earlier. It's from 1915, but this actual copy is from 1957. You've got the Recorder, the Bon Combat, which is the one that's edited in Guadeloupe by Stéphane Rousseau before he goes to Paris and becomes an activist there. And I think that's an important point to make, because I think often we think about people beginning and becoming in England or in France, and that clearly isn't the case here. He's already a journalist, and then he travels. And then The Voice of St. Lucia, which is still in publication. There's a handful of them that are. The Voice is one, Justice is another. That might be the only ones, actually. I said that. So this is the Voix des Nègres. It's the again, a Paris-based newspaper from 1927. And this is one that I quoted where they talk about for independence. This is that. And you can see it both in English and French, if that's
That's just me, but I think the slides are a bit slow. Here we go. I'm now seeing La Voix des Nègres. Oh, have we lost Dr. John? Did we ask her to turn on the slides and then lose her again?
I'm back.
Okay, here we go. The slides keep throwing it off. Are there any more questions before we try that again? If there's any more questions, just put your hand up, Theron, or if you can just put on your video and we can see you. I have another question though, before we resort to losing you again, if we can, is about archives again and personal papers. So a lot of some of the newspapers I'm looking at are held in personal archives. And what's your position on those, on these, papers that possibly could have a wider use for academics and kind of people studying the societies and are being held privately?
By privately, do you mean by the family, or do you mean like in private archives that no one can access?
Well, I suppose by family members and people like that. Do you think we should be kind of encouraging people to get those things into public circulation, or how do we, as I suppose I'm thinking of myself now as an academic and thinking about building these archives and a canon of Caribbean literature, or Caribbean writing, Caribbean letters. So what do you have, and I'm thinking about my dad is in this meeting right now, and we have boxes and boxes of publications from the 60s or so in England, in London, like holy for them. But what do we do with them? Because we don't want to give them to the British Library or, somewhere here. What do you think is the reason that we
dear. Zakiya, you put me on the spot in front of all these people. You're all very nice, but I'm literally working on a project at the moment which thinks about these things, because there are people who don't want to leave their hands their papers in the hands of the state. That is a real thing. People, especially people who've a lot of the people that I mentioned have a long and conflictual relationship with the state. Mm-hmm. And so what do they do? And how do we think about it? So I think independent archives is one option. I do think one of the things that we need to be careful of, particularly when we're dealing with people in the Caribbean, from the Caribbean, is I think we have to make sure that they're available to people based in the Caribbean. So I do think whether it's digitized or microfilming documents, I do think there has to be, even if they're held somewhere separately, i.e. they're held in the Stromberg or they're held in wherever you think is a safe space. Mm-hmm. I think it has to be done carefully. I do think we have a lot of people who, I think we're at a particular point, to be honest, where there's a generation of people now who have, like you say, boxes at home, that we need to get those boxes before they pass away and their children get tired and need to chuck them because they need to sell the house. And I do think we need to be thinking about that very carefully, because, it's sort of, the 70s were a while ago now, the 60s are a while ago now. That generation of activists are dying. And we need to be proactive about organising their papers.
Oh. My dad is in it. That's it. My dad is listening right now. You're going to frighten him. I don't think that he's going to.
No. I mean, but I think it's something we need to be. I think as historians, it's something that we have to be thinking about really active, because there are places that we can deposit our papers. But there are a lot of people who are skeptical of the state. They've had a long, difficult relationship with it and don't want to leave them in state archives. And I think I mentioned it in the paper that that's where most of them are at the moment. And I don't know places like the West Indian collection in Trinidad at the University of the West Indies, they're quite good at taking personal papers. Mm-hmm. So that's, if people are wondering, that's one particular repository. But can they take all of them?
For your upcoming work, you said you're working on this kind of question right now, so we need to just...
I'm thinking about it. We can continue the conversation after.
We can. So are there any more questions? I don't know if anyone wants to ask one straight up.
Can I ask one?
Go ahead.
I'm kind of curious if other people have been thinking about these kind of publications previously? Like, you've come to the talk today and I'm really glad, but do other people do similar work? I know someone mentioned that they did work on St. Vincent. Is there anybody else doing anything
Lorraine,
like that?
you want to tell us, can you turn on your audio, your video if you feel like it, but at least your microphone, can you tell us?
I turned my mic on. I'm just trying to do that. I've been on Teams all day and now I'm on Zoom. I cannot find the buttons. So bear with me 1 second, and I'm hoping that you can see me now. Let's have a look. How's that? Almost. Yeah, I kind of can't get the camera right, but yes, I am real. I'm here. There you go. Yeah, everybody. Okay, yes. So there's so much of what you said today, Kesewa, that I was like, oh my God, it's just excited me, delighted me.
Thank you.
Particularly around the archives. And I don't know your history, but I'm born in England. Parents came over in the 60s. You know, how many times can we tell this story? And my parents don't understand why I am so excited about all of this. And when I went to the archives in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, I thought I was floating, you know? So I just so connected with what you said in terms of being able to touch the papers and look outside and think that's when that happened. And just that other comment as well around that generation who are going to be, their stories will be lost to us if we don't capture them. So I mean, you can probably hear I'm very excitable anyway, but just I'm really passionate about this, and to hear that all of us are making that contribution because you didn't have opportunity, you can't do everything, you know. So we've got, if you like, regional representation with an overlap, because this is such, particularly in the Eastern Caribbean and what we call marginal Caribbean. God, we have some words. Just for those underrepresented voices now to come to the fore in terms of where they, you know, to situate them in this broader narrative. And sometimes you can feel like you're the only one, that, you know, and that, for instance, hearing you come up with almost like nerd-like levels of, in 1942 this happened, so went with this one, and hearing you do that and thinking, oh, I'm not the only one, I can do that for St. Vincent as well. So it's not so much a question, but it was more to let you know, we're just kind of images at the moment, but we're here all behind you and really, really impressed with what you've done and encouraged as well. And, you know, I'm so keen to hear what your upcoming projects around archives in particular, because I'm just thinking about the next big storm, the next flood, somebody's basement getting flooded, or something happening with all of those precious papers for people like us, because that's my heritage, which, unless we capture it, is just going to be lost. So, you know, you've definitely got somebody in your corner here who's beating the same drum as you, Kesewa. So thank you so much.
No, that's really nice. Thank you. That's really, really nice. It does feel like, it does feel like a bit of a random thing to be interested in, newspapers from like the 1930s. I don't mind mentioning how randomly I got interested in it. I was really interested. So my work, I probably, for those of you who don't know, my work really builds on the work of sort of two kind of, or maybe three scholars in particular. One of them is Hakeem Addy, who did a book, Pan-Africanism, Communism, about all these different Black organizations in Europe and the Caribbean. And I was like, they did what? Where? I'd never heard of them before, and I got really interested. Then there's another work called Practice of Diaspora by Brent Hayes Edwards, which looks on the relationships between English speakers and French speakers in Europe at the same period. And then the one that kind of probably sent me down the newspaper route, and then a book called Colonial Metropolis by Jennifer Boitin, which looks in only at Black organizations in Paris in the 1930s. And then Leslie James is probably the person that sent me down the newspaper routes, because at the end of her thesis, she published, like she produced this like list of places where George Padmore published his journalism, and I was like, whoa, so many places. And so from those secondary sources, I got really curious because they kept talking about a few things, and I was like, well, what do they all, and they were all talking about these organizations existing, and I was kind of curious, like, what were they talking about? What were the issues that they were campaigning on? And they did that groundwork of discovering these organizations, if you will. And my research really builds on their work, because it kind of outlines what the organizations were saying, what they were doing, what the newspapers did and said. And in doing that research, I then discovered that newspapers were talking to each other, and that blew my mind. And well, you've just heard the paper that's kind of led towards.
Thanks. I just want to give Khadija just a minute or so just to tell us a little bit about your research. Khadija just finished a PhD on Black British magazines from 1960 to 1980. So do we say Dr. Khadija? Can we just hear a little bit? Welcome. Let's hear a little bit from you. Thank you.
Congratulations.
Congrats.
Thank you. Yeah. It was, so there's obviously just listening, there's sounds like there's some, there's some things that kind of lap over, which is really interesting, just hearing the people who were involved, especially when you're talking about Caribbean writers coming to the UK and who they are writing for, because they would write for the magazines as well, like Jan Carew, and or publish extracts from their books and things like that. So that was really exciting. But at the moment, Andrew Sorkey, his whole archive is at the British Library, and it's not open yet, but it's going to be worth going to look at, because he was so involved with the publishing side of things. Because I also looked at the book publishers as well, and he was just so involved with the publishing. It was incredible. So that conference, we just had a conference a couple of weeks ago, last week, beginning of December or end of November, beginning of November, and so we had a conference on that as well, that the British Library organised. So that was really good, and he was just involved in so many aspects of print before he went to America. So yeah, I've been looking at some really interesting publications and seeing where the overlaps were and seeing what emerged. So my thing was really to see how Pan-Africanism emerged from all of those publications, which came out quite strongly, and then just looking at another definition of what Pan-Africanism meant. Because really, when who was speaking about the links between in the Caribbean, those of African descent and those of Asian descent, and realizing that they were basically have to work together. It was the same thing in the UK, because that was the only way that you were going to avert that divide and rule, was to actually work together. So how do you kind of operate that unity and equality to kind of fight against the colonial aspects that were going on, so that's what came through quite strongly through the magazines and even the book publishers as well. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Khadija. Just if you want to share some details in the chat, if anyone wants to kind of find you, I'm definitely interested. So if you want to, please do that. We must wrap up because we told you.
Okay, great.
I did want to say that we're happy to, once we finish recording, to keep the chat open if people want to have a quick chat, stick around for a bit and have an informal chat with each other. So we can do that.
Well, otherwise, we just want to say thank you for joining us today. And thanks to Dr. Kesewa John for sharing that paper. I'm going to let you have the last word, Kesewa, from me. So thanks from me for hosting, but I'll let you tell us what you want to tell us. It was great, really good. You're going to hear from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for turning out. Thank you, Eve and Jack, for inviting me to speak today. Thank you for Zakiya for accepting to chair. It was a real honor to be able to hear from you about your research and to have my research kind of supported by someone who had a clue as to what I'm talking about. Often it feels like talking into the wind. And also to meet Khadija and to hear that other people are doing research on Black print publishing that I didn't know about is fantastic. I'm really looking forward to wondering how we can connect, because I think it sounds like a panel or a conference or something. There are work to do. Thank you. This is a work in progress, so please, feedback welcome.